to see you all here. The lesson text this morning comes from Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 through 32. Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 through 32. The same night, this is talking about Jacob, the same night he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go, unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. Roughly 800 or so years ago, near the small town of Aquino, Italy, there was born there a man named Thomas Aquinas. Have you heard of him before? Thomas lived an incredible life. By good fortune, he was born to a family of means. His father was a very high-ranking officer in the Emperor Frederick II's army, and he was very wealthy for this. His family was also religious, as you should be, in 13th century Italy. And Aquinas' uncle was the abbot of Monte Cassino, at one point considered the most preeminent monastery of the world. His family assumed that Thomas would eventually join his uncle at Monte Cassino, but Aquinas had other plans. Around the time Aquinas was coming to age, there was a new group gaining notoriety, a religious order called the Dominicans. They were a monastic order dedicated to study and preaching, and they dedicated themselves to a life of poverty also. They were sometimes called the Order of Preachers. However, they weren't very socially well regarded, since they were a young and relatively unknown group. The prestigious order of the time was the Benedictines. They were wealthy and powerful, and since Aquinas was born to a very well-to-do family, they fully expected him to join the Benedictines. But Aquinas had other ideas in mind, and he joined the Dominicans instead of the Benedictines. There's a legend, and I'm not sure how true this is actually, but it's a good story, that his family so disliked that Aquinas was going to join the Dominicans that they hired a prostitute to seduce Aquinas, to force him to break his vow and be forced to leave the Dominican order. His brothers then locked him in the room with this prostitute and wouldn't let him out. But Aquinas was so steadfast in his devotion, as the story goes, that he chased her out with a burning stick. All right, that's a good story. I don't know if it's true, but it's a good story. Eventually, Aquinas went to Paris, where he was appointed to study and teach at the university there. And at the University of Paris, Aquinas earned the nickname the Dumb Ox. What an awful nickname. There were apparently 2 reasons for this. First, Aquinas seemed to be quite large, thus being called an ox. He loomed over others. But secondly, he seemed to have been awfully quiet and reserved, and so the dumb part. Not as an unintelligent nickname, but just saying he was quiet, he was mute. There was a tradition at the time of having what were called disputations, which were basically public and formal arguments. They happened constantly, and it was like the sport of the time. It was a huge event. Everyone came out for them. But Aquinas was often reluctant to join these debates, despite what would later be seen to be a real aptitude for them. He was really good at arguing, it would turn out. And so Aquinas' teacher, Albert the Great, eventually said of Thomas, "We call him the dumb ox, but in his teaching he will one day produce such a bellowing that it will be heard throughout the whole world." Albert saw ahead of time what would eventually be true. Aquinas would go on eventually to produce many great works, including commentaries on many books of the Bible, as well as a number of short essays that are very influential. But by far, his most famous works were his Summa Theologiae, which translates to something like Summary of Theology, and his Summa Contra Gentiles, which translates to something like Summary of the Reply to the Gentiles. These are massive works. I don't know if you've ever seen them. The English versions that are pretty much the most popular, it's printed in 5 separate volumes, and it is more than 3,000 pages. I want you to take that in for a moment. Someone writing over 3,000 pages in just one work before there were word processors. I'm not sure I'm going to accomplish that, and I have computers. But Aquinas' works were magisterial. The basic format, at least of the Summa, is something like this. Each section considers just a single question. He's very single-minded in this way. Questions like, if God is omnipotent, could he change the past? Have you ever thought about a question like that before? If God is omnipotent, if he can do anything, can he change what has already happened? That's a weird question. How should one understand the nature of the Trinity? I've thought about that before. Or how should one understand how it is possible for Christ to be fully divine and fully human? Or are the human virtues different than the Beatitudes that Jesus gives in the Sermon on the Mount? Questions like those. For each question, Aquinas first considers what someone who disagrees with his position would say, and he gives the strongest argument against his own position, and he gives as many as he can think of. Consider how charitable and confident in one's own position you'd have to be in order to start each question like this, to think about what the other side would say. It is an incredible work. But something happened to Aquinas before he could finish the Summa. He would eventually leave Paris. He would go to Naples for a time, and while there, something strange happened to him. While Aquinas was worshiping at church one Sunday, he experienced an unusually intense experience of being in the presence of God. It's not that he reported seeing a vision or anything mystical like that, but he just had this profound experience of God's presence as he was worshiping. And in the wake of this experience, Aquinas was changed. In the days after this event, he abandoned his usual routine of teaching and writing. He rested and he reflected, but he didn't work at the feverish pace that he used to. At one point, his personal scribe became concerned for him, and he begged, his name was Reginald, and Reginald begged him to return to work, to finish the last part of the Summa. But Aquinas replied, "Reginald, I cannot, because all that I have written now seems as straw to me." Despite his incredible work, in light of an actual experience of the divine, his work now seemed to him absolutely inconsequential next to the reality of the God he had seen. After this experience, Aquinas was almost a shell of himself. And in fact, on a trip back to Paris, a short bit later, Aquinas was struck in the head by a branch of a fallen tree, became ill, and after a few days, died on March 7, 1274. He was just 49 years old. And that brings us to Genesis 32. In Genesis 32, in the lesson text for the sermon this morning, we read about Jacob, who wrestles with someone. Is it a man? Is it an angel? Is it God? We'll return to those questions in just a bit. But first, some background. Remember Jacob? Jacob is the younger brother of Esau. They're twins, but Esau was born first. Esau, we're told, is a hunter. He's hairy. He's muscular. He's a man's man. He's a man of the field. Jacob, however, is born second, grasping Esau's heel, as Genesis tells it. And in contrast to Esau, Jacob is not hairy. He's simple. He dwells in tents. And since he was born first, Esau should receive the family blessing, and with it, the majority of his father's inheritance. But, famously, Esau sells his birthright to Jacob in a moment of weakness. And on top of this, Jacob deceives his own father Isaac when he was at the end of his life and blind. Isaac had intended to bestow a blessing on Esau, but instead he accidentally bestows it on Jacob. When Esau finds out about this final act of betrayal, He seeks revenge upon his brother, and Jacob is forced to flee and hide. By the time we get to Genesis 32, it has been many years since Jacob has been on the run. In that time, Jacob has met Laban and his daughters, Rachel and Leah. Maybe you're familiar with the story. Laban promised Jacob that if he labored for him for 7 years, he would give his daughter Rachel in marriage. But after those 7 years, Jacob receives back the medicine he has been dispensing to others. Instead of Rachel, he was instead tricked into marrying Laban's older daughter, Leah. Laban then promised that after yet another 7 years of labor, he would give Jacob his daughter Rachel in marriage, which this time he eventually does, but it takes 14 years. Jacob then grows a large flock, becomes wealthy, and leaves Laban. Among other things, Laban's not happy that Jacob has left, though, and so Laban pursues Jacob. Jacob has cheated me, he thinks. But while on the pursuit for the revenge, on the very night before he reaches Jacob's family and his flock, Laban has a dream. God appears to Laban and tells him not to say or do anything evil to Jacob. And so the next day, Laban catches up to Jacob. But as he was warned in his dream, he doesn't harm Jacob. Instead, they make peace, and they each go their own way. Finally, Jacob is able to go home. But there's just one problem. And the problem is that waiting back at home is Jacob's older brother Esau, who he has tricked, stolen his birthright, and stolen his father's dying blessing. So as he approaches the land of Canaan, his homeland, Jacob sends messengers to Esau. The messengers return to Jacob with terrifying news. Imagine you're Jacob. It's been at least 14, maybe more years since you've seen Esau. You're coming back. You're not sure after how many years what Esau is thinking anymore. Has he mellowed out? Has he harbored this anger the whole time? The messengers come back, and here's what they tell him. Esau is coming out to meet Jacob, and he's coming with 400 men. So what would you be thinking his intentions are if he's coming with 400 men? Jacob, always thinking a few steps ahead, decides to split up his family and his flock into two groups. He thinks to himself, if Esau comes to the one group and destroys it, then the other group that is left will escape. Jacob is prepared for the worst. And so before he meets Esau, Jacob prays this prayer. O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, and I will do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed the Jordan, and now I have become two groups of people. Deliver me, please, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I am afraid of him. He may come and kill us all, the mothers with the children. Yet you have said, I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted because of their number. And so with this prayer, Jacob makes camp for the night as he waits for the rising sun, when in the morning he will meet Esau for the first time in many, many years. Here we arrive at the lesson text for the sermon this morning. For it is in these circumstances we find Jacob in Genesis 32. It's night. It's the night before he meets Esau, and we're told that Jacob has sent others ahead. At this point, the author of Genesis tells us Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Who this man is, we're not told. Where he comes from, we don't know. And why does Jacob wrestle him? Maybe one day we'll find out. But in any case, the writer of Genesis tells us that the man, whoever he is, did not prevail against Jacob through the night, so he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled him. And once he had done this, after he had put Jacob's hip out of socket, he calls on Jacob to let him go, because the day is breaking soon. Night is almost over. But Jacob refuses. He says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And so this mysterious grappler, seemingly taken aback by the demand, asks Jacob his name. Jacob, he responds to him, which means something like heel catcher or the one who comes after. No longer will you be called the one who comes after. No longer will you be called Jacob, the man tells him. From now on, you are Israel, the one who struggles. "This is your name," the man said, "because you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." This must have made Jacob wonder, who is this man? He thought he had been wrestling a man all night, and yet this man has told him he's striven with God and with humans. But when he asks a name back, he gets no answer. And there the narrative simply ends. We hear nothing about the man leaving or what happens after Jacob is given a new name and blessed. It's as though the man simply vanishes right then and there, as the text tells it. And who is this man anyway? Some contemporary scholars have tried to suggest that the author of Genesis is imagining a metaphorical battle between Jacob and the local pagan god of the river who won't let him pass over. Others have suggested possibly it's Esau he wrestles. But the earliest interpreters of the Bible had a different opinion. A few thought that Jacob wrestled an angel. That's the sort of the image that's on the screen. After all, we're told it's a man that Jacob wrestles. But the man is able to put Jacob's hip out of socket just by touching it. And he's able to bless Jacob, as though he's not quite human, he's something higher than that. Angels do appear in the Old Testament as men. We talked about this in Bible class today. So it wouldn't be an unusual thing, I suppose. But the far more common interpretation among the church fathers and mothers is that Jacob wrestled with Christ himself. The prophet Hosea tells us that Jacob indeed wrestled God. This is from Hosea chapter 12, verses 2 through 3. The Lord has a charge to bring against Judah. He will punish Jacob according to his ways and repay him according to his deeds. In the womb he grasped his brother's heel. As a man he struggled with God. So it was God that Jacob wrestled with. And yet Genesis tells us that the person Jacob wrestled was a man. He was a God man, I suppose. You can see why early interpreters of the scripture thought this was Jesus that was being talked about in Genesis. And indeed, in the aftermath of the encounter, Jacob says he's seen the face of God. So Jacob called that place Peniel, which in Hebrew means the face of God. For Jacob says, I have seen God face to face, yet my life is preserved. And from there, Jacob went on to meet Esau, limping as he goes. For, as Genesis reminds us, when you encounter God face to face, expect to walk away limping. Are you with me? Many of the Christians I have looked up to in life have had an experience like Jacob's. Not literally, of course. I don't know about you, but the handful of times in my life I've had someone tell me about the time they wrestled a mystery man through the night only to find out it was God they were wrestling with, I usually pass over to the other side of the road and go on my way. Okay, so not literally, but spiritually, I know many Jacobs. Maybe you do too. In my own spiritual journey, there have been at times when I have gone through periods of doubt. I've had times when I thought, what I knew, I no longer could believe anymore. What I had been told, what I had grown up believing, what beliefs I thought I had considered and made my own, it turns out I hadn't thought very carefully about after all. This can often be a disorienting experience when you go through periods of questioning your most deeply held beliefs, your values, and the ideas at the very core of your identity and who you are. That can often feel like you're grasping about in the dead of night, like Jacob. And when those questions are about God and the Bible, about your place in the church, it can feel an awful lot like wrestling with God. Like Jacob, we sometimes find ourselves wrestling with God in spiritual darkness. Doubt, spiritual wrestling, it can be exhausting. And yet it's the kind of thing, at least I have found, that I have a hard time letting go of. Jacob didn't let go of it. The man that he wrestled asked Jacob to let him go, but Jacob wouldn't. But the thing is, doubt has its way of holding on back too. It takes two to wrestle, after all. Many Christians go through this experience. I would go so far to say that every Christian should go through this experience. Doubt and questioning don't make you a bad Christian, a bad believer. They make you like Israel, who strove with God and with humans. They make you like many people in the Bible, in fact. David had doubts. Peter had doubts. Abraham, Ruth, Elijah, Esther, Paul, John the Baptist, Mary Magdalene, they all had doubts and questions in their lives. If you have too, then welcome to the great cloud of witnesses. But here's the thing about wrestling with God. It will sometimes take a long time, and it will not usually be pleasant. Jacob wrestled through the whole night, and I imagine at the end he must have been exhausted. Spiritual wrestling is sometimes not enjoyable, but at the end it results in blessing. Indeed, it may even result in seeing the face of God, but it may also result in a spiritual limp. Consider Aquinas. He had spent almost his entire life thinking and writing about God, Christ, and the church. But on that fateful day that he seemed to encounter God face to face, everything changed. Compared to the splendor of God, Aquinas remarked, "All that I have written seems like straw to me." And he had written a lot. Or consider a parable told by the contemporary theologian and philosopher Peter Rollins. It goes something like this. It's a parable, it's made up, but it goes something like this. Near Jericho, a great scribe was sitting one day, quietly reflecting by the roadside. And as he contemplated life and faith, a large and noisy crowd stumbled by. The scribe became intrigued by all the activity, as this was usually a relatively relaxed place to sit. So he called out to one of the passers-by, "What's happening?" The man he addressed didn't stop, but shouted excitedly, "Jesus of Nazareth is approaching the city." The wise man had heard much talk of Jesus, and so he eagerly joined the crowd. After some walking, everyone came to a halt, and the silence descended upon the crowd. As the scribe looked up, he saw Jesus walking through the masses, talking with the people and hearing them. And as he watched, a cry welled up from deep within him, and he began to shout, "Son of David, have mercy on me, a sinner." Those who led the way rebuked him and told him to be quiet. But the scribe shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And as Jesus came near, he stopped and asked the man to approach. When the scribe came near, Jesus touched him and said, "Your faith has healed you." But at that moment, he was made blind. When all the people saw what had taken place, they were horrified. But Jesus paid no heed to them. Instead, he put his hand on the shoulder of the scribe and whispered, "You'll be blind for just a little while." To this the man replied with a smile, "O Lord, it does not matter in the least. For the moment you touched me, I saw all that I ever needed to see." Now, I'll reiterate that this didn't happen. It's a parable. It's meant to illustrate a point. But it illustrates well a point I'm trying to make, which is this. Genuine encounters with God can be at once beautiful and devastating. How could they not be, after all? If you thought that you, with your finite human mind, could even approximately conceptualize God, well, you'd be mistaken. Encounters with God are overwhelming. And I don't even mean mystical encounters. This doesn't have to be some grand vision or ecstatic experience. I mean even the day-to-day encounters, the encounters of God one has when you read the scriptures, the small, mundane experiences you have when you have the sense that God is near. These change a person, sometimes even in ways that aren't comfortable. So, are you wrestling with God? If you are, it will leave you limping and maybe bruised. But if you persevere in your wrestling, if you stick with your questions and with your doubt, and you push through to the other side, you'll end up being blessed. Jacob, who wouldn't let go of the angel, demanded a blessing, and so he received one. And that blessing was a new name, Israel. "You shall no longer be called Jacob," the angel said to him, "but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans." This tremendous episode carried with it a deep spiritual awakening for Jacob. He was defeated and powerless, but he clung to God and wouldn't let go, and he received a blessing. It's written in Genesis that Jacob prevailed, but how did he prevail? He won by surrender, by confessing his unworthiness and the admission of his name. His name means heel catcher, and by pleading for the blessing which could only come from the grace of God. That is precisely the way the saints of all ages have triumphed. Cling to the Lord and never let go. Here Jacob received a final lesson that humbled and finally broke his self-will. Finally he learned. In his whole life he had been trying to snatch a blessing by his own will, by his own action, by his own cleverness. But now he finally accepted it as a gift of God's grace. In the aftermath of wrestling with God, if we press to the other side, not seeking to achieve salvation by our own means, by the work of our own hands, but to receive it as a gift from God, we will be changed. Aquinas was, and Jacob was. And so, for those Christians and seekers who at times struggle, who at times feel like they're wrestling with God, who question and who doubt, I hope you know that you're in good company. Doubt and faith can exist together. It's part of becoming a spiritually mature Christian, in fact. We each, at our own pace and in our own way, must wrestle with the things that we have believed, and we must, when reason demands it, change those beliefs. And that is not usually a pleasant process, but it's an important one, even if it means that from now on you walk with a spiritual limp. So may you come to find that wrestling with God is part of the spiritual journey. May you, through your wrestling and doubt, catch just a glimpse of the face of God and be blessed. And may you learn in the aftermath to walk with a limp. Let's sing.